schönen guten Morgen. Good morning. Welcome to the press conference on the occasion of the first meeting of states parties to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Mr. Schallenberg, the floor is yours.
Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, dear Peter, dear President, good morning. It's a pleasure to have you all here in Vienna today. This January, only a couple of months ago, the 5 recognized nuclear weapon states, China, France, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States, affirmed that the nuclear conflict cannot be won and must never be fought under any circumstances. The statement might be right in itself, but it's definitely incomplete. The potential horror of these weapons is unimaginable. Recent studies have shown that the humanitarian repercussions of a nuclear war would in fact prove even more catastrophic and wide-ranging than what was believed during the Cold War. From the beginning, Austria has been at the forefront of the fight for nuclear non-proliferation and nuclear disarmament. In 2014, as part of the Austrian Pledge, later called the Humanitarian Pledge, more than 130 states committed to prohibit nuclear weapons due to the unacceptable humanitarian consequences. 3 years later, in 2017, 122 states adopted the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and last year, this treaty finally entered into force. That means that through our collective efforts, we have actually fulfilled our pledge. We have come one big step closer to a world free of nuclear weapons. 1 year ago, 51 states had ratified the treaty. Today, at this first conference of state parties, already 65 states have ratified, and 24 more states have signed the treaty. Only in the last days, 4 states have deposited their documents of ratification. So patiently and step by step, we are continuously enlarging the group of countries committing themselves legally to the prohibition of nuclear weapons. Throughout these efforts, the International Committee of the Red Cross has been a reliable partner, and I should say a key partner. Actually, the first call for the total abolition of nuclear weapons from the ICRC dates back to 1945, to the end of the Second World War. And it was the ICRC which has been very early on focused on the humanitarian perspective of nuclear weapons and the catastrophic consequences they can create. And therefore, I'm very thankful to you, Peter, to the President of the International Committee of the Red Cross, not only for being so steadfastly next to us and fighting shoulder to shoulder this battle, but to be here today with us. And I'm looking forward to many more years of common cooperation and work to get a world free of nuclear weapons. Ladies and gentlemen, this should be actually a day to celebrate, but actually we meet in a time of crisis, at a watershed moment. Never since the Cold War has the threat of nuclear escalation been more present. This must be a wake-up call for all of us. The nuclear sword of Damocles is more present and hanging lower over our heads than ever before. So many red lines have been crossed in the past month, and we cannot allow nuclear destruction to be one of them. The mere threat of using a nuclear weapon is utterly unacceptable. The humanitarian consequences would be catastrophic. And yet, nuclear states continue to rely on the nuclear arsenals for their national security. But the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons proves that the majority of states does not accept this logic, does not accept the logic of nuclear deterrence, that they consider it actually an existential risk to all states and to all of humanity. It is high time, ladies and gentlemen, that we break the myth that nuclear weapons provide security. In reality, they are real and present danger to all of us, today and in the future. That is why this week in Vienna, we want to send a very strong signal that the TPNW is the new norm. The treaty must be the beginning of the end of the devastating and threatening weapon of nuclear power. Together we can be successful in shifting the public debate and change the public perception on nuclear weapons. We call on all states and all non-state actors to keep up the pressure. We want to increase step by step and steadily the number of ratifications, strengthen the norm against nuclear weapons, and work together towards the ultimate goal, a world free of nuclear weapons. Given the existential threat to humanity, the status quo is simply not an option. We need to abolish nuclear weapons before they abolish us. This is a work we'll continuously do for us, for our safety, and for the safety of future generations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Minister. Dear Alexander, it's great to be with you and with all of you today. Thanks for the interest. I would like to echo and emphasize some of the points that Alexander has just made. The continued existence of nuclear weapons is one of the biggest threats for humanity. Their use would be disastrous, capable of ending life as we know it. In Hiroshima and Nagasaki almost 77 years ago, the ICRC, together with the Japanese Red Cross, attempted to provide relief to tens of thousands of wounded and dying people in near impossible conditions. The horrors of Hiroshima show nuclear weapons' impact on human health, the environment, on future generations. If a nuclear weapon were to detonate in or near a populated area, no state or international body could adequately address the immediate humanitarian emergency, nor the long-term consequences to people and the environment. Any use of nuclear weapons and any threat of such use is morally indefensible. Now is the time to translate the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons into action. I strongly commend the more than 60 states that have joined the treaty and many others that have signed it. The first meeting of States Party, which begins today, is an important milestone for the success of the treaty. I wanted to thank Austria for hosting this historic meeting. Austria has been a humanitarian champion and a strong advocate for nuclear disarmament on all fronts. Austria has played a critical role in placing the catastrophic humanitarian consequences at the center of the nuclear debate and taking forward multilateral negotiations towards the elimination of nuclear weapons. It is extremely doubtful that nuclear weapons could ever be used in compliance with international humanitarian law. They are inhumane and immoral. Eliminating them is the only guarantee that the horrors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki will never happen again. The first meeting of states parties underscores the treaty's significant added value within the broader nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation architecture. I'm encouraged to see several states that have not signed the treaty attend this meeting as observers. Nuclear disarmament is a common interest and a common responsibility, and we owe it to future generations to work together to make a world free from nuclear weapons a reality. Austria has been a staunch supporter of efforts to strengthen the protection of civilians in urban warfare as well. States finalized on Friday a groundbreaking political declaration in Geneva on protecting civilians from the harm caused by explosive weapons in populated areas in which Austria played a central part over the years. The declaration has received strong support by many states, and we are hopeful that it will lead to concrete change on the ground and reduce the unacceptable civilian toll of urban warfare. The ICRC is also gravely concerned about the use of unlawful weapons and misuse of lawful ones in conflicts globally. We continue to speak with states directly on these issues and work to develop policies, standards, and norms to minimize their impact on civilians. We are looking closely at the impact of new technologies, such as autonomous weapon system and cyber operations, could have on civilians, and given the speed of technological development, it is critical that limits on their use are urgently agreed upon to limit their potential harm to civilians. I wanted to add these sentences to our today's focus on nuclear, because Alexander and Austrian foreign policy have been staunch supporters of weapons-related restrictions and restriction negotiations in the international arena over the last decades. And I wanted to use this opportunity to present to you also the larger picture of efforts that we are undertaking, and we are very grateful to be today with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions? Yes, please.
Thank you so much for doing this. My name is Gakushi Fujiwara from the Asahi Shimbun, Japanese newspaper. As you see, there are a lot of Japanese media covering the TPNW, the first meeting. But as you see, the Japanese government is not attending as an observer. What is your response to that?
Well, obviously, the conference was open to everybody, but it's the decision of each and every government to decide whether they attend or not. We have 49 state parties present at this conference and 33 observer parties at this conference. And this is the first conference of state parties. So my hope would be that we will continue to grow, that more states will sign, more states will ratify, and at the next conference, which might take place in next year in Mexico, that other countries or other governments which have, for the time being, decided not to be here today, that will be present at the next conference. This is a long process. We won't have successes overnight, but we are very patient and obstinate.
The former president of the United States once said in the direction of nuclear weapons that they maybe not in his lifetime may be abolished. What makes you sure that you, in your lifetime, will experience that nuclear weapons will be abolished?
Well, I have the intention to still be around for a couple of years, A, and B, if we look at the past, if we look at cluster ammunition, if we look at anti-personnel mines, at the beginning, the reaction was always the same. You will never get there. Forget it. There are states who are producing it, states which have stockpiles of these weapons. It is being used. How naive can you be? Or it's even dangerous to try to abolish them, that you're weakening the whole international system. And I believe what we have achieved each time is this, and this is what we present here, this public partner and private partnership. This is a PPP. We changed the atmosphere, we changed the perception, we changed the public debate. And this is what the TPNW is about. We don't expect overnight to have results, but we have to start somewhere. And that so many states, members of the UN, actually joined a treaty which a couple of years ago everybody said you will never even get to a legal text. You would not even have a treaty to be ratified by any state. And look at here, we have the first state party conference. We have a treaty. Over 60 states have already ratified it. Yes, I agree, no nuclear power has been part of it. But that was the beginning of cluster ammunition and landmines. This was exactly the same situation. So we get there patiently and step by step. But this is something where simply the fact, if you think about Murphy's Law, that if something can go wrong, it will go wrong one day. The fact to have this Damocles sword of nuclear weapons hanging over your head is simply too big a threat. And the humanitarian consequences, the environmental consequences, the economic consequences would be so devastating with the slightest mistake that this is something we cannot simply live with.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yes, please.
Yeah, I have actually two questions. One is that now that with the war now that the war in Ukraine is going on, would that war give any impact in the discussion of this conference? And especially considering that the 5 NATO member states at the last minute joining, do you think that the Ukrainian war and this imminent threat of the nuclear risk in Europe is sort of making people more aware of the situation? Thank you.
Well, we have war is back in Europe, and war has been launched by a nuclear state on a neighboring state in a brutal and unjustified way. And I remember when, a couple of days after launching his attack, the president of the Russian Federation stated that the degree of alarm for the nuclear deterrence forces will be increased. Everybody got extremely nervous suddenly. And all the media around the world were reporting about this. And this is about a fact where only a couple of months ago everybody said, well, this is very theoretical, it will never be used. And see, something happens and suddenly it becomes a real and present danger. People are reporting about, people are worried about. And I believe we're here together, that this is something we cannot continue living with that. We have to do something about it. And I'm very happy to have so many media from Japan, which is a country which has suffered, where people have experienced the atrocities that this weapon is creating. And I have to say very clearly one thing, the logic that nuclear weapons create security is actually an extremely dangerous, not only a wrong notion, but it's a dangerous notion, because it would mean that actually everybody should get them to be safe. That would be a call for proliferation of nuclear weapons. And that's exactly the contrary of what we want.
Jo, ich werde vielleicht am Schluss noch 2 Dinge.
Klaus Brempers, also a question to both of you, to President Maurer and Minister Schallenberg. The probably failure of the reviving of JCPOA, will this not also hamper this conference and the treaty? And so you can no longer really call it a milestone, this conference?
Well, JCPOA has not failed yet. The discussions are ongoing, but yes, it is a difficult discussion, and each time they meet, I meet the leaders of the delegations of both sides. But I would say, on the contrary, because even those who have been critic of the JCPOA have to say, what would be the result? It's an imperfect treaty, yes, absolutely, granted, but it's better than having nothing, because the alternative would be probably a nuclear arms race in the Gulf region. And it shows that this is one of the elements where we try to create a framework and to curtail this kind of ambition, but there's no direct impact actually on the TPNW. TPNW is an international instrument where countries can join and should join, and we call on them to join, which creates a legal commitment to prohibit and abolish all forms of nuclear weapons.
Maybe on my side, just to emphasize and add what Alexander mentioned before in response to another question. We are here on a road which is a long-term effort, and we don't expect necessarily to have linear evolution and progress. We may have stepping backs and ups and downs in the implementation of what our effort is, but the milestone language comes from the fact that a substantive number of states assures entry into force for them as a legal obligation of the TPNW. So it is a milestone independently on what happens in other areas. The second thing I wanted maybe still to emphasize listening to your question is that don't underestimate the paradigm shift that this treaty has emphasized. And the paradigm shift is looking at weapons not only in a security perspective, but in a perspective of its humanitarian, environmental, and health impact. And that's what brought the breakthrough on mines, which were for decades anti-personnel mines were for decades looked by the militaries as an exclusively military and security instrument. And as long as it was only seen as a security and military instrument, it was difficult to come to an agreement on the prohibition of anti-personnel mines. And it was that mind shift and paradigm shift to look at weapons not only in security and military perspective, but in humanitarian environment and health perspective that made this shift possible, and I think we should never underestimate. And that's the reason why I have mentioned at the end of my statement also other efforts at the present moment underway. And it is important to have states coming together with regard to the impact of urban warfare. Urban warfare kills, and so we need to sensitize the community of state of these humanitarian impacts. That's the reason I'm here as a representative of the Red Cross and the Red Crescent movement and the broader civil society, because the broader civil society wants leaders to factor in the impact of weapons on the broader society and not look at weaponry only as a security and military tool, which is under security and military logic and negotiations which are only informed by these logics.
Okay, one last question, Appa.
Thank you very much. My name is Stefan Waspanik from the Austrian Press Agency. I've got one question for each of you. First one for you, Mr. Maurer. You're coming from Switzerland, and how come that Switzerland is not part of this treaty? We've heard a lot about NATO having pressurizing their members not to be part of the treaty, but evidently this does not apply to Switzerland. What are the reasons why Switzerland is not part of this treaty? And one question in German to the Foreign Minister. Herr Außenminister, die Kommissionspräsidentin sieht keinen Grund dafür, den Beitrittsprozess zu reformieren. Haben Sie mit Ihrem Vorstoß Schiffbruch erlitten? Oder wie sehen Sie das, dass sie sich dazu äußert, zu einem Vorstoß, den Sie an die Mitgliedstaaten und an den Herrn Borrell gerichtet haben?
Well, let me just be clear that I'm speaking for the International Committee of the Red Cross, which is an independent and impartial organization with its seat in Switzerland, but not an organization which is part of the Swiss government, and therefore I won't pronounce myself to the decisions of the Swiss government, which similarly to the Japanese government's response that Alexander has just given a minute ago, is each government's decision on when and how and if they want to join this treaty. As a Swiss citizen, I can tell you I would warmly welcome such a decision by my government, but that's on another page. And that's probably as far as I can go as a president of an independent organization like the ICRC.
Ich darf vielleicht, if you allow, I can answer the one question in German. Ich glaube, da liegt ein Missverständnis vor. Österreich hat nie vorgeschlagen, den Beitrittsprozess zu ändern oder zu reformieren. Der wurde ja tatsächlich vor 2 Jahren angepasst und das System funktioniert und müssen wir auch weiterführen. Der österreichische Vorschlag geht in eine andere Richtung. Beitrittsprozesse sind unglaublich langatmige, Jahre, wenn nicht Jahrzehnte dauernde Prozesse. Und in der Zeit, und das sehen wir gerade am Balkan, laufen wir das Risiko, die Bevölkerung zu verlieren, die Unterstützung zu verlieren, weil sie jahrelang nichts spüren an dieser EU-Perspektive. Das bleibt sozusagen ein Papiertiger. Und unser Vorschlag ist diese graduelle Integration, dass wir in der Zeit, ohne die EU-Vollbeitrittsperspektive aus den Augen zu verlieren, das ist ganz wichtig, und ohne dass der Beitrittsprozess, die Verhandlungen irgendwie geändert werden, dass in den Bereichen, wo ein Staat zum Beispiel in Beitrittsverhandlungen schon angepasst hat, seinen Rechtsstand, schon eine ausreichende gerichtliche Kontrolle gewährleisten kann und entsprechende Regelungen national hat, dass er da schon politisch so behandelt wird, als wäre er Mitglied. Also das kann zum Beispiel im Energiebereich sein, das kann bei transeuropäischen Netzen sein, das kann im Bereich Horizon Europe zum Beispiel Forschung sein. Ich habe immer wieder das Beispiel genannt, wie kann es sein, dass der Westbalkan, der umgeben ist von EU-Mitgliedstaaten, dass dort Autobahnen gebaut werden von chinesischen Firmen, die manchmal von nirgendwo ins Nirgendwo führen und die letzten Endes aber 2 EU-Staaten miteinander verbinden würden, nämlich Griechenland und Kroatien oder Bulgarien und Kroatien. Warum sind die nicht schon längst Teil eigentlich der transeuropäischen Netze mit Zugang zu den Fonds? Also das ist keine Änderung des Beitrittsprozesses, sondern es ist einfach, ihn sozusagen greifbar zu machen, verständlich zu machen, damit nicht das geschieht, was wir momentan beobachten, dass die Europäische Union zwar vielleicht einen Kandidatenstatus verleiht, Verhandlungen eröffnet. Nordmazedonien ist seit 17 Jahren Beitrittskandidat. Das ist jetzt fast schon eine Generation langsam. Da verliert man die Menschen, da verliert man die Bevölkerung. Wir haben zum ersten Mal in Serbien Umfragen, wo die kritischen Stimmen zur EU größer sind als die befürwortenden Stimmen. Das muss die Alarmglocken losgehen lassen innerhalb der Europäischen Union. Und das ist die Stoßrichtung des österreichischen Vorschlags. Also ich glaube, da liegt ein Missverständnis vor, aber das klären wir auch gerne auf und das wird natürlich auch Gelegenheit geben, noch vielfältig darüber zu diskutieren. Das ist nicht ein Vorschlag, der jetzt auf diesen EU-Gipfel oder auf die momentane Situation allein gemünzt ist, sondern wir haben eine geostrategische und geopolitische Verantwortung als Europäische Union gegenüber unserer Nachbarschaft. Die ist nicht nur beschränkt auf Osteuropa, sondern auch auf Südosteuropa. Beides Gegenden, die genau gleich weit weg sind von Wien. Ukraine ist 500 Kilometer circa entfernt und Bosnien auch. Und ich kann nur sagen, unsere geostrategischen Seismographen schlagen gerade massiv aus. Das sind volatile Gebiete. Da kann es zu einer Hangabrutschung kommen, politisch. Und wir müssen gerade jetzt sehr aufpassen, was wir für Signale schicken an unsere Nachbarschaft. Sorry for the lengthy answer. In German, it was another topic not related to the TPNW.
Thank you very much for your interest. Thank you, Minister. Thank you, President.
Thank you very much.